So today we've got an interesting video. What I'm going to be doing is determining not only the best player from each decade in the NBA, but also the best possible starting five made up of the best players from each decade. Now typically on this channel you're not going to see me make that many all-time videos, but I think this is a great overall video because it allows us to show our appreciation to each different era in the NBA. As fun as it is to chime in on the LeBron James versus Michael Jordan debate, which I'll probably end up doing on this channel and give you guys my thoughts on that, realistically we'll never know who the true GOAT is because everyone plays in a different era of basketball. And the best that we can do is determine the GOAT from each decade. So that's what I'm going to be doing today, along with, as I mentioned, the best possible starting five, basically the all-decade teams from each decade. So for the 1950s, I really don't know that much about the decade, so we're just going to skip over that one and start with the 1960s. And for this decade, their starting five is Oscar Robertson, Jerry West, Elgin Baylor, Bill Russell, and Wilt Chamberlain. So there's your all 1960s decade team, and the honorable mentions for this one go to Bob Pettit and Jerry Lucas. So if you want to talk 1960s basketball, obviously I'm not the guy to talk to. But I can definitely say that I know a little bit about these players and their games and their legacies. And I can say that this easily isn't the worst starting five of the video, despite it being the 1960s. You've got Oscar Robertson, who in my opinion is a top 15 player of all time and the third best point guard of all time. And he averaged a triple-double over his first 5 seasons in the NBA, which is an incredible accomplishment. Then you have the two Laker legends in Jerry West and Elgin Baylor, who personally I think are top 30 players of all time. Then you have two arguably top 10 players of all time and two of the most dominant big men ever in Bill Russell and Wilt Chamberlain. In terms of who the GOAT is for this decade, it's obviously between Bill and Wilt, and while some people would give it to Bill Russell because of his rings, I'm going to go with Wilt Chamberlain just because of his sheer dominance on the offensive end of the floor and on the boards. Keep in mind this guy averaged 50 points in a season once. No matter what era of basketball that's in, that's incredible, and because of this and his offensive dominance, he's my GOAT for this decade. Moving on now to the all-decade team for the 1970s, and their starting five is Walt Frazier, John Havlicek, Julius Erving, Elvin Hayes, and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, with the honorable mentions going out to Bob McAdoo, Rick Barry, and George Gervin. So this is probably overall the worst starting five of the video, but something that stands out is this team's defense, and if they were a team, obviously they'd be dominant, and especially on the defensive end of the floor, as 4 of these players in their starting five are all defensive players that have made the all-defensive team multiple times over their careers in the 1970s. And the GOAT for this one is easily Kareem. Kareem, in my opinion, is the third best player of all time, and none of the other players on this team are in the top 10, so he gets the GOAT. He was a dominant player, winning 6 MVPs and 6 championships, with a few of those coming in this decade, which was when he was in his prime. So that's why he's the GOAT for this decade easily. Now for the 1980s, their starting five is Magic Johnson, Michael Jordan, Larry Bird, Moses Malone, and again Kareem, with honorable mentions going to Isaiah Thomas, Julius Erving, and Dominique Wilkins. Probably so far this one's the best of the video, and it seems just absolutely incredible, but something you do have to remember before you get ahead of yourself here is in the 80s, Michael Jordan hadn't necessarily hit his prime yet, and he actually started his career in 1984, and then Kareem is past his prime in this decade. So really, it is an incredible team, but those guys aren't exactly in their prime. And for the GOAT for this one, it's between Magic Johnson and Larry Bird. Anyone that watched the NBA in the 1980s knows that the two best players were easily Magic and Larry, and probably one of the best rivalries of all time, and definitely in the 80s. And when we decide who the GOAT is for the decade, and just all time in general between Magic and Larry, they're so close in both MVPs, championships, overall game, overall legacy. But because in the overall game category, I really just have to go with Magic Johnson because his playmaking and passing ability was something that's unmatched in the history of the NBA. And because of that, he actually lands in my top 5 of all time on my list, as I'm sure he does for a lot of other people too. So overall, this starting 5 is really good, and the GOAT for this decade goes to Magic Johnson. So now moving on to the 90s, which is arguably the best decade ever in basketball, and this is probably the best, if not the second best, starting five of the video. And the starting five is John Stockton, Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen, Karl Malone, and Hakeem Olajuwon, with 4 honorable mentions going out to Charles Barkley, who I very highly considered putting over Scottie Pippen, which I'll discuss in a second, and also Shaq, David Robinson, and Patrick Ewing, 3 centers also getting honorable mentions there. So as I was mentioning, I almost put Charles Barkley over Scottie Pippen. It was probably the hardest decision to the video, and on my all-time list, I actually have Charles Barkley a bit higher than Scottie. But for the 90s, I think Scottie was just a little bit better because, first of all, of his defense, and he was 6 championships with Michael Jordan. And Charles Barkley was dominant in the 80s too, and more dominant than Scottie Pippen. So that's why Charles Barkley is higher on my all-time list. So that's a very interesting player comparison there. And like I mentioned, this starting five overall is really good, with 2 top 10 players in Michael Jordan, obviously, and Hakeem Olajuwon, and the GOAT of this decade is Michael Jordan, no questions asked. So now we have the 2000s decade, which was a great basketball decade, and for this starting five, we have Allen Iverson, Kobe, LeBron, Tim Duncan, and Shaq, with the honorable mentions going to Kevin Garnett, Dwayne Wade, Steve Nash, and Dirk Nowitzki. So for some reason, this is a great decade for power forwards, as we have 3 top 5 power forwards in Tim Duncan, Kevin Garnett, and Dirk Nowitzki, so that I found that interesting. And then for the starting five, Allen Iverson versus Steve Nash was a very, very tough comparison, but I gave it to AI ultimately because of his dominant scoring. Then we have 3 top 10 players, arguably, in Kobe, LeBron, young LeBron that is, with the Cavs for this decade, and Tim Duncan. And then we have Shaq, who, if this all-decade team could get early 2000s Shaq, it would be the best of the video, no doubt, as in those decades, that was when Shaq was in his prime years and the best player in the league. Near the end of the decade, he got old and definitely started to fall off, but in the early years, as I mentioned, he was MVP caliber dominant, no question. So it's a good overall starting five, and in terms of the GOAT, it's between Kobe and Tim Duncan. I want to throw LeBron in there too, and I think he would have a lot better legacy if he had a good team in this decade, because he was still really good. But ultimately, for the 2000s decade, it's between Kobe and Tim Duncan, and I have to go with Kobe because of his overall game. And of course, as always, rest in peace to the Mamba. And now for the 2010s, we have a starting five and an all-decade team of Steph Curry, James Harden, LeBron, Kevin Durant, and Anthony Davis at center, with honorable mentions going to Kawhi, Russell Westbrook, and CP3. And this starting five, I'd say, is top 3 of the video too. It's hard to order them, but I definitely say the top 3 are 90s, 2000s, and 2010s. And in terms of this all-decade team, we have the two greatest duos of the decade. So we have the Golden State duo of Steph Curry and Kevin Durant, and then we have the late decade duo, so the Lakers duo of LeBron and Anthony Davis. And then you have James Harden, and we know what he can do. But on this all-decade team, he could also add value as an off-ball guy and a shooter. So overall, this team's really good. This all-decade team is really good. As I mentioned, top 3 of the video in my opinion. They have offense, defense, playmaking, shooting, and just a very good overall decade. And the GOAT for the decade is LeBron James. So to finish off the video, I'm going to give you my predictions for what this is going to look like for the 2020s decade. And overall, I think it's going to be a really good decade of basketball, and I can't wait for it. And for the starting five in the all-decade team, my predictions are Luka Doncic, Anthony Edwards, Jason Tatum, Giannis, and Nikola Jokic, with the honorable mentions going to Zion, who I actually think is going to win an MVP in this decade, but I think Jason Tatum will end up the better overall player, and Zion also might have some injury problems, so I have to leave him out unfortunately, but he'd be the 6th man of this all-decade team. And then also honorable mentions going to Trae Young, who just has to improve his defense, Kawhi, and Devin Booker. The only player that's not in the league that I put on this team is Anthony Edwards, and as you can see, I'm very high on him. I think he could turn into a Dwayne Wade type of player. And in terms of the GOAT for this decade, it's between Luka and Giannis in my opinion, and I think it's going to be Luka. As you guys know, if you watched the Western Conference predictions video, I'm very high on Luka, and one of my hot takes is that he's already a top 5 player in the league, and I definitely think he'll be the GOAT of the 2020s decade and go down as one of the greatest of all time. So there you have it. Those are my all-decade teams for the NBA, the best player from each decade in my opinion, and my predictions for the upcoming 2020s decade of basketball. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like, subscribe if you're new so you don't miss out on any new videos. As always, thank you for watching, and I will see you all in the next video.